The rain drummed steadily against the window, casting a rhythmic, hollow sound through the dimly lit apartment. James Holloway sat in his worn-out armchair, a whiskey glass in one hand, an old case file in the other. He had been staring at the yellowed pages for over an hour, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't remember that night. 40 years ago, in a small diner on the east side of the city, a man had been murdered. A clean hit, one bullet to the chest, execution style. No fingerprints, no witnesses willing to talk. The case had gone cold almost immediately, and yet, here it was, decades later, staring back at him. James had solved hundreds of cases in his career. Some had been easy, some had haunted him. But this one felt different. Maybe because it had happened so long ago. Maybe because he had been there. The phone call had come that morning, from a voice he hadn't heard in decades. "James, you need to look at this again. It wasn't what we thought." That was all they had said before the line went dead. No name, no explanation, just those words. Now, sitting in the dim glow of his desk lamp, he flipped through the crime scene photos. The grainy, black and white images of the victim sprawled across the diner's tiled floor. Blood pooling beneath him. A shattered coffee cup near his outstretched hand. James swallowed hard. It had been a long time since he last saw these. He flipped to the next page. A witness list. Statements from the few people who had been there that night. His stomach twisted. His own name was on the list. James stared at the paper, his own name glaring back at him like an accusation. Witness, Detective James Holloway. Statement, unable to recall details of the event due to injury sustained at the scene. His pulse quickened. He had been there. He had seen the crime. But if he had given a statement, why couldn't he remember any of it? The memories from that night were like smoke, always there, just out of reach, impossible to grasp. He flipped the file closed and took a deep breath. There was only one thing left to do. He needed to go back. The diner still stood, though the neon sign above the entrance flickered with age. It had changed owners a dozen times, but the bones of the place remained the same. As James stepped inside, a bell chimed above the door, the sound pulling at something deep inside his chest. The waitress, an older woman with tired eyes, looked him over. "You look like you've seen a ghost, hon." "Maybe I have," James muttered. He slid into a booth in the corner, the same booth from the crime scene photos. He could still picture the body slumped over the table, the blood pooling beneath it. But he couldn't remember actually being here. His hands instinctively moved across the table, fingertips brushing over the old wooden surface. What was he missing? The waitress came back with a steaming cup of coffee. "You from around here?" James hesitated. "A long time ago." She gave him a knowing look. "Lot of old ghosts walk through these doors." He glanced up. "Do you remember a murder here? 40 years ago?" Her face changed. The warmth in her eyes faded, replaced by something cautious. "People around here don't talk about that," she said quietly. James leaned in. "I need to remember I was here that night." The woman swallowed, then set the coffee pot down. "Then maybe you should talk to Eddie." James's brows furrowed. "Eddie?" She nodded toward the back of the diner, where an old man sat hunched over his plate. "He was here that night too, and unlike you, he never forgot." James approached the man carefully. Eddie looked up as he neared, his wrinkled face unreadable. "You're James Holloway," Eddie said before James could introduce himself. The statement knocked the air from his lungs. "You remember me?" Eddie nodded. "Of course I do." He took a slow sip of his coffee, studying James. "You were here the night it happened, but I don't imagine you remember much." James sat down across from him. "That's why I'm here." Eddie smirked, shaking his head. Took you long enough? James swallowed. What happened that night, Eddie? The old man's expression darkened. He set his cup down and leaned in. You don't remember, because you weren't just a witness, Holloway. James's throat went dry. You were the only one left alive. James felt the weight of Eddie's words settle over him like a suffocating fog. The only one left alive. His fingers curled into fists beneath the table. What do you mean by that? Eddie exhaled slowly, tapping his calloused fingers against his mug. You really don't remember, do you? James shook his head. Nothing. Just flashes, like pieces of a broken mirror. Eddie studied him for a long moment, then sighed. All right, Holloway. Let's see if we can put those pieces back together. He leaned forward, voice lowering to a whisper. The night of the murder, this place was nearly empty. Just a few of us left. Me, you, the victim, and one other man sitting at the counter. Eddie's gaze darkened. That man? He walked out alive too. A chill crawled up James's spine. Who? Eddie's jaw clenched. That's the thing. No one ever found out. The police report barely mentioned him. But I saw him. And I know you did too. James's head throbbed. His mind clawed at the fog, desperate to find something solid. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force the memory forward. And then, a flicker. The diner's overhead lights buzzing. A man sitting at the counter, his back turned. A muffled conversation. A raised voice. A gunshot. James's eyes snapped open, his breath unsteady. There was someone else. Eddie nodded grimly. That's right. And whatever happened after that shot was fired? He pointed a weathered finger at James. You knew it back then. But someone, or something, made you forget. James's pulse pounded. He had spent decades believing he had simply blacked out, that whatever had happened that night had been lost to the chaos. But now, it felt like something had been taken. He leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. Eddie, do you know what I said in my statement? Eddie nodded. Yeah, and that's the strangest part. James braced himself. You told the cops you never even saw the shooter. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. That's impossible. Is it? Eddie tilted his head. Or is that what someone wanted you to believe? James's mind raced. The case had gone cold for a reason. But if his own memory had been altered, if someone had made sure he wouldn't remember, then whoever had pulled the trigger that night was still out there. And they had kept him quiet for a reason. James pushed himself up from the booth, his hands shaking. I need to find out who that man was. Eddie watched him for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Then you need to start where it all ended. James narrowed his eyes. And where's that? Eddie's lips curled into something between a smirk and a warning. The police archives. James exhaled. You think something was buried? I know something was buried, Eddie said, and I think it's time you dug it back up. James glanced at the rain beating against the diner's window. For years, he had convinced himself this case didn't matter anymore, that some things were better left unsolved. But now, standing on the edge of something bigger than he had ever realized, he knew one thing for certain. He had to remember before it was too late. The police archives hadn't changed much in 40 years. Same cold metal shelves, same flickering fluorescent lights, same scent of dust and aging paper. James stood at the entrance, his fingers tightening around the visitor's pass clipped to his coat. The receptionist had barely looked at him when he signed in. To them, he was just another retired cop chasing ghosts. But this ghost had his name written all over it. He found the cold case files tucked away in the farthest aisle. The murder at the diner was buried deep, its folder pressed between dozens of others. He pulled it out, the weight of the past settling into his hands. Time to see what they didn't want me to remember. He flipped through the report. The familiar black and white crime scene photos, witness statements, his own name on the list. Then, something was off. His official statement was short. Too short. Detective Holloway does not recall the events leading up to the shooting. Arrived on scene after incident. No further details provided. James's heart pounded. He knew that wasn't right. He had been there. He had seen it. But here on paper, it was as if he had simply walked in after the fact. He turned the page. Except there wasn't a next page. His statement should have been longer. He would have given more details. But the report ended abruptly. Someone had removed part of it. James swallowed hard. His own memory might have failed him. But this was deliberate. And then he saw it. A signature. Not his. Lead detective, Robert Calloway. James's stomach twisted. Calloway, the man who had been his superior, the man who had signed off on closing the case, and the only man who would have had the power to erase James's memories of that night. James didn't waste time. Within the hour, he was standing outside a rundown apartment building on the east side of the city. Calloway had retired years ago, disappeared from the force quietly. No fanfare, no retirement ceremony, just gone. Now, as James knocked on the apartment door, a shuffling noise came from inside. A few seconds later, the door cracked open. A frail, older man peered through the gap. His hair was white now, his face carved with deep lines. But those eyes, sharp, calculating, hadn't changed. "James Holloway," Calloway murmured, almost amused. "Didn't think I'd ever see you again." James didn't smile. "Yeah, well, neither did I." Calloway studied him for a long moment, then sighed. "I suppose you're here about the diner case." James's stomach dropped. He hadn't even asked yet. Calloway stepped aside. "Come in, Holloway. It's time you finally learned the truth." James sat across from Calloway in the dimly lit apartment. Old case files and dusty memorabilia littered the shelves. The ghost of a life spent chasing criminals. Some caught, some never found. Calloway poured himself a drink, his hands steadier than James had expected. "You really don't remember that night, do you?" James shook his head. "I get flashes, but it's like looking at something through fogged glass." Calloway sighed, leaning back. "That's because it was meant to be that way." James frowned. "What the hell does that mean?" The old detective swirled his glass, choosing his words carefully. "You weren't just a witness that night, Holloway." His gaze darkened. "You were the target." James's breath caught in his throat. "What?" Calloway nodded. "You and the victim, Clayton Reeves, walked into that diner together. You were sitting in that booth. You talked to him before the shot was fired." James's vision blurred. He could almost see it now. His own hands on the table, a man sitting across from him. But the face, Clayton's face, was still a shadow in his mind. "But why?" James whispered. "Why would someone want me dead?" Calloway took a slow sip of his drink. "Because of what you and Reeves knew." James felt his heart pound. "And what was that?" Calloway set his glass down with a quiet thud. "Something worth killing for." James ran a hand through his graying hair, his mind racing. "Then why don't I remember any of this?" Calloway let out a heavy breath. "Because we made you forget." Silence. The weight of those words crashed over James like a wave. "You were shot that night, Holloway. A bullet grazed your head. You hit the floor. Concussion. Memory loss." Calloway's voice lowered. It wasn't clean, but it was convenient. James's fingers curled into fists. "So you just decided to bury it?" Calloway exhaled. "It was bigger than us, kid. There were people involved. People who didn't want you remembering. And believe me, they weren't the kind of men you argue with. James swallowed hard. Who? Calloway shook his head. I don't have names, but I know one thing. Whoever killed Reeves wasn't just covering up a murder. They were making sure you'd never come back to finish what you started. James sat back, his chest tight. The missing pieces were clicking into place. The erased statement, the missing memories, the bullet wound he had never questioned. He wasn't supposed to come back here, but he had. And now, someone was going to notice. Calloway's eyes darkened. Listen to me, Holloway. You dig too deep, and you're going to find something you don't like. James met his gaze, his old instincts kicking in. Then I guess I'd better start digging. Calloway shook his head, almost smiling. You never knew when to walk away. James stood. And I never will. As he stepped toward the door, Calloway's voice stopped him. You figure out who pulled that trigger, he said, his tone eerily calm. You'd better be ready for what comes next. James didn't look back. Yeah, he muttered. I will be. Then he walked out into the night, knowing the next move he made might just be his last. Here. But he had. And now, someone was going to notice. The cold night air wrapped around James as he stepped out of Calloway's apartment. His pulse was steady, his breath slow, but inside, he was a storm. You weren't just a witness, you were the target. The words wouldn't leave his head. For 40 years, he had lived with the belief that the case had simply gone cold, that the killer had vanished into the night, leaving nothing but questions behind. But now, he knew the truth. The case hadn't gone cold. It had been buried. And someone had made sure James would never remember why. James didn't go home. He drove straight to the last place he knew he could get answers, the police archives. This time, he wasn't looking for the crime scene report. He was looking for something bigger. The name Clayton Reeves. Calloway had said they were together that night, that they knew something. But what? He sifted through file after file, the dim glow of the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows over the documents. Then, after what felt like hours, he found it. A separate file. Reeves, Clayton, Internal Affairs investigation. James's breath hitched. Internal Affairs? He flipped it open. Clayton Reeves wasn't just some guy. He was a cop investigating corruption inside their own department. James's stomach twisted. That's what this was about. Reeves had found something big enough to get him killed. And James, whether he had realized it or not, had been the only other person who knew. That's why they had erased his memory. That's why Calloway had covered it up. Because the corruption went all the way to the top. And if James had remembered, he wouldn't have lived to see the next day. James closed the file, his mind racing. He needed to get this information out. Now, but just as he reached for his phone, the archive room's lights flickered. Then, in the silence, he heard it. A slow, deliberate footstep. James froze. He wasn't alone. His fingers curled around the edge of the desk as he turned his head slightly, listening. Another step. Then another. Someone else was here. Someone who had been waiting. His instincts kicked in. He grabbed the file, shoving it into his coat as he slid out of his chair, just as a figure stepped into the dim light. A man. Tall. Dark coat. Eyes locked onto him. James didn't need an introduction. They had finally come to finish what they started. James didn't wait. He moved. In one motion, he grabbed a nearby chair and swung it between them, buying himself just enough time to bolt for the door. The man lunged, but James was already in the hallway, running. Footsteps thundered behind him. James turned a corner, heart pounding. The archive exit was just ahead, but he knew deep down that even if he got out, this wouldn't end here. They had let him live once. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. But James wasn't that young cop anymore. This time he was ready. James didn't go home that night. He didn't go anywhere predictable. Instead, he went straight to the press. If Internal Affairs had been investigating a cover-up back then, there had to be people still looking for answers. And if James had learned one thing in his life, it was this: secrets only have power as long as they stay buried. By morning, the headlines would be everywhere. Cold case cover-up. Former detective reopens decades-old murder investigation. Names, evidence, the corruption that had almost cost him his life. It was all coming out now. They might come after him. They might even try to silence him again. But James Holloway had spent 40 years in the dark, and he was done forgetting. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Some truths are buried so deep, they're meant to be forgotten. But sooner or later, the past always finds a way back. What do you think? Should James have left the past buried, or was he right to dig it up after all these years? Let me know in the comments. What would you have done? And if this story kept you on the edge of your seat, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that make you question everything. Because some cases never stay closed.